during the bear market, scams really trend down. In fact, it's one of the most, it's the main crime category that actually moves with the market when you compare it to other types of crime, which are pretty much what we call price agnostic. So as scamming has gone down, we've seen scammers being forced to adapt by adapting this pig butchering approach, where rather than just waiting for people to come to them, they'll be really proactive in finding their victims. They will reach out to people through a variety of ways. Romance scams is one of the biggest types of pig butchering, where someone will create a fake relationship with someone and lure someone into a feeling that, hey, this is maybe my relationship, and then they'll ask for crypto, and then they'll kind of go MIA.
Hey there, good people in crypto land. I'm Matt Leising, and this is my podcast, Decent People. Welcome to the conversation. Today we're doing something a little different. I am talking to Kim Grauer, who is the head of research at Chainalysis. Chainalysis is a blockchain forensics firm. So what that means is they are really good. They're like cyber sleuthing. They're going and using the public blockchain records to figure out what happens when you get rugged, or if there's a scam, or what North Korean hackers might be doing in terms of trying to launder the funds that they steal. It's a fascinating part of the crypto world, in my opinion. What Chainalysis has been doing for 6 years is putting out a crime report where they kind of synthesize everything and break it down into categories like money laundering and scams and pump and dump and all the crazy stuff that we all hear about and read about in the news far too often. So in light of the 2022 crime report, Kim agreed to come on and talk me through it all. We get into some great, interesting scams, one of which is called a pig butchering. So you're going to want to stick around for that. And we also get into one it's called oracle manipulation, where somebody stole $117 million roughly from the Mango protocol last year and came out publicly and said that he had done it and that he was simply obeying the protocol's rules. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about what law enforcement thought about that sort of explanation. So without any further ado, let's get to the conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much. Hey Kim, how you doing? Great to see you again.
Hey, nice to see you too.
Thanks so much for doing this. This one is going to be a little bit different of a Decent People podcast. We're going to, rather than kind of jump into your background and where you came from to get into crypto, we're going to kind of jump into the Chainalysis 2022 crime report, which is full of awesome topics like scams and money laundering and all sorts of nefarious stuff. So Kim, you guys again have done an amazing job. This is a 109-page report. I highly recommend everybody listening to go check it out. You can download it for free. So Kim, thanks a lot and great job on this report.
Thank you so much for saying that. I live in the report for so long that when you kind of release it, it's your baby. You get a little bit nervous. So it's really nice to hear that you enjoyed it and found it useful.
I did. And I wanted to say it's actually really well written. And I don't say this about a lot of things because a lot of times they're not. But whoever has the lead writing gig on this one was very clear, very concise, and just really very well written from page 1 to page 109. So that was a pleasure.
That's all Henry. Henry is our writer. He is an incredible writer. I keep telling him, when are you going to go write your memoir in like the Pacific Northwest? But yeah, he's a great writer, really knows how to communicate complex topics to a general audience.
Yeah, he did that very well. So keep him around because that's a skill. Okay, so let's jump into it. Even though there was an all-time high in 2022 of $20.6 billion in crypto crime, that represented only 0.24% of all crypto activity. So that's something you and I have talked about before, and I thought it's a good sort of context to set this conversation into, because I think a lot of people who are crypto skeptics just sort of dismiss it as nothing but scams and fraud. But here, it's less than 1%, and we're talking about all the categories that we're going to dive into. And we've talked about that before, but can you just give me a little bit of background on that and how you see that less than 1% sort of, in the bigger picture here?
Yeah, you're certainly right that a lot of non-crypto people have this preconception around how much criminal activity is happening on the blockchain. And to be honest, I don't quite know why that is so hard to fight. This is our sixth crime report, and
Yeah.
we've consistently put out numbers around legitimate use cases of crypto. And there's no equivalent data for how much crime is happening with cash. So it's quite a persistent narrative that I would, it's one of those things I want to have like a bar conversation with someone trying to dissect why it is that people have such strong preconceptions about cryptocurrency and its use cases when they're not in the industry. But when it comes to this specific number, this is something that we we it's kind of one of the crucial numbers that we put out each year. And it's what we're seeing is that we can calculate how much criminal activity is happening by nature of what Chainalysis does. And I'll give a little bit of a quick background on that. Chainalysis ingests blockchain. So we get blockchain data. And crucially, what we do though is we associate the addresses that are transacting on the blockchain with named services. And that allows us to create kind of a phone book of cryptocurrency activity. And that's great for businesses.
So can I jump in just for a second?
Yeah, please.
So you mean, the Coinbase deposit address, correct? And other, that's what you're talking about. There are companies or individuals have publicly said, this is my address, right? And you don't have to do that. It can be pseudonymous, but other folks do have to disclose their crypto wallet address. Is that and that's what you mean, right? So you can kind of map out some of the territory?
Yeah, the ways that we go about it, we employ several different heuristics. It's not just about publicly listed addresses. There's other things under the hood that allow us to do this. But that is essentially right. Any service that deals with cryptocurrency controls cryptocurrency addresses, and our business is to say who controls what addresses.
And I noticed you guys are very careful. You don't usually publicly disclose that, but you obviously behind the scenes know what you're doing and can trace things. But in your reports, you'll say that money laundering happens on centralized exchanges most often, but you don't say, and these are the centralized exchanges.
We don't do that. We're interested in the trends and raising awareness about the trends that are happening, but we don't give away information about individuals or individual services unless they've given us their approval or there's a real reason to do so, just because we don't want to be in the business of kind of like throwing people under the bus or doxing people. Yeah. I mean, we work closely with services behind closed doors when it's appropriate, but we don't do that in our public reports.
And that's a really interesting point, and one I'd want to emphasize is you said in the traditional financial world, there's no analog to this because it's the transparency in the financial world, the fiat, like US dollar-based or euro-based, whatever, doesn't exist like this, where on a blockchain, everything is publicly viewable. So I think that's something that people should really keep in mind. And I was thinking about it about kind of the skeptic argument that this is all for crime and stuff. And the only thing that I could think of is that all the scams and frauds get widely reported, and so that that can kind of take over the narrative sometimes. Like in the fall, with FTX and OFAC. Before that, with Tornado Cash, it was like a drumbeat of really bad negative news. And then on the other hand, when a transaction successfully goes through, or I'm using a DeFi protocol to get some interest, that's not news, but that's the vast majority, like more than 99% of what's happening. So I guess it's just maybe a bias of what people see in the news or read about, but I would like to have a bar conversation with somebody about that too, like you were saying.
Yeah, like I wonder if it's psychological, like a fear of new technologies, or crypto is one of those subjects that everyone has an opinion on,
Yeah.
and you kind of fall in one camp or the other. It's just one of those divisive subjects, and it's we hope people can read between the lines with when we put out our crime report and think, wow, it's kind of powerful that one data set can look at all of these different types of criminal activity and look at every single what we call path, but it's basically transaction history that's feeding into those addresses, and then ask where are all those funds going to. And there's just a lot of potential to fight crime with this data set that yeah, it's kind of a read between the lines thing, but I definitely hear you that we are hammering this in the media, and there's a lot of negative publicity on crypto, which is probably feeding into the narrative a little bit.
Yeah, I think so, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump into some of these different categories, and again, just sort of set the context. In 2022, at least, crime as a share of all crypto activity was trending down. So let's keep that in mind. It's probably a function of the bear market, as you guys note in the report, because
It actually was, sorry to interrupt, it did trend up this year. So
Oh, in 2022 it was?
yeah, the share associated with illicit activity was 0.12 in 2021 and 0.24 in 2022. So it's a small amount, but that was a reversal that we saw.
Okay. Thanks for that correction. So I would be remiss if we didn't start with pig butchering scams, because how can you not go right for that? So I don't think many people listening to this know what a pig butchering scam is. Kim, can you just kind of give us the overview of what that entails?
Scamming, so pig butchering specifically is a type of scamming approach, how you go about carrying out a scam. It's not referring to like anything related to pigs at all. And
yeah, it's a metaphor, people.
It's a metaphor, and it's actually quite a crude metaphor. I think there's been a lot of resistance internally to using it, but I think it means, you fatten up a pig for the slaughter. And how that applies to scamming is, whereas there have been many different waves of scamming in crypto that have been kind of consistent with whatever period of time we are in the adoption curve. But right now, and immediately before this, we saw a lot of investment scams where people there would be a website, and it would say, hey, double your crypto every 30 seconds forever. And people would invest in that. They'd kind of go find the website, and they just take it upon themselves to do this. Of course, marketing was a part of this, but during the bear market, scams really trend down. In fact, it's one of the most it's the main crime category that actually moves with the market when you compare it to other types of crime, which are pretty much what we call price agnostic. So as scamming has gone down, we've seen scammers being forced to adapt by adopting this pig butchering approach, where rather than just waiting for people to come to them, they'll be really proactive in finding their victims. They will reach out to people through a variety of ways. Romance scams is one of the biggest types of pig butchering, where someone will create a fake relationship with someone and lure someone into a feeling that, hey, this is maybe my relationship, and then they'll ask for crypto, and then they'll kind of go MIA. And scam is also one of our biggest types of criminal activity. Over $5 billion scammed in 2022, which was down from 10 billion the year before. So this is a lot of money is still going to these types of scams, and increasingly pig butchering is a part of that.
Yeah. So it's sort of like catfishing, right? Or something where, you're just leading someone along for a long time online, and then kind of pulling the rug out from under them at the end. I was really interested to read in the report that there have this law enforcement is sort of adapting to this a little bit, or at least you mentioned this, and this is a mouthful. It's the California Regional Enforcement Allied Computer Team. REACT is the acronym there. So they're investigating these scams. They're up in the Bay Area in California, and you've got you mentioned the Santa Clara County DA Aaron West. And as long as these have happened in their jurisdiction, they as you report, there's been some success at getting some of the funds back. Is that correct? And can you kind of tell me how does that happen?
The React team has been extremely proactive and leading the way in realizing, hey, let's go from reactive to proactive. Let's really start investigating these types of scams, and have actually come to us and asked for ideas on how can we help here. And what we do when, and this is another kind of read between the lines thing, but when you know exactly where crypto is going, it's always, by and large, criminals want to find an off-ramp where they can convert their crypto to some sort of fiat option, so that then they can go, use it and deposit it in their bank account and do whatever they want to do with it. And crucially, when it hits a service, that means that those services typically have regulatory obligations on collecting know your customer information on who these individuals are. But also, if you alert a service that illicit funds have flown through your exchange, then you can either freeze the funds if you're fast enough, or if the KYC credentials are not faked, you can initiate a law enforcement investigation and hope to get those funds back through the legal process.
Yeah, and as you guys wrote about, a lot of times law enforcement or other people won't learn about this until weeks or months after it's happened, and by then it's way too late. So I can see how if a romance scam is involved, or an investment scam where you feel like, oh, I was such an idiot, it might be hard to admit that. But if anybody's listening and you do get scammed like this in the future, it's really important to try to react immediately, right? Because the money, the trace could still be there, and you might have a much better chance of getting your funds back.
Yeah, and I'll just say one other reason why it's important to get law enforcement involved is a lot of times these scammers are actually connected to many other scams and are doing this systematically, and so getting more information about how the funds are moving means that you can have a real impact at shutting these big operations down. And so that's another kind of motivator is stopping these scam networks.
That's a great lead into my next question. But I did want to say just one last thing on the romance scams, which pig butchering is a part of. I found it interesting that those are the largest scams per capita, based, you listed other types. And so around almost an average of $16,000 was taken from folks in those types of scams.
They're definitely high value. I saw $1 million romance scam this year, and their investment scams might take lower values, but in romance scams, definitely they can get away with getting more from the victim.
So that leads into like what you were saying, where sometimes there are these concentrations or networks of scams. And one thing I found really fascinating in this report was how you guys started with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission had come out and was charging 5 different scam sort of websites, I guess, or operations. And so what you guys did was you took those 5 websites and you looked into them, and I think I'll just try to get this right, but I think all of them had an address that was common in Los Angeles, right? And that was sort of a lead where you're like, okay, well, they could be using a fake address, or they could be kind of stupid and they're using the same address for these 5 different things, 5 different scam operations. But then, so you guys, you sort of verified or found on your own the websites and crypto addresses for 3 of those 5, and you sort of started from there. And then after doing some pretty smart, website analysis and searching for things on the wider web, where you use the same sort of copy that these three sites had used and other elements. You guys were able to uncover 200 more scam sites that were basically looked pretty much exactly the same. And I just find that fascinating. Can you did I get that right? And what else is there to fill in on that?
Yeah, you did. And this is just one example of employing open source tactics like that to be more proactive and find more scam leads. You can also analyze the transaction activity of those sites, and we were able to further confirm that they were operated by the same bad actors because of confirmations and overlap in the transaction networks, follow the money. And that gave us further confirmation that these were connected. But you can do this in a variety of other ways as well. And one thing we know about scams, and we actually know this to be true in DeFi as well, is it's pretty easy to create a new scam, or, not saying DeFi protocols are scams, or just launch a new smart contract by just kind of copying and pasting some core code. And in the case of scams, just copying and pasting your underlying website and then launching a new website, and that looks the same, but it's really low cost to carry out the attack because you've just basically changed the name and we're able to relaunch your attack. And we can see these scammers, okay, they'll do one scam, okay, they shut that down, and then another one pops up with kind of basically the same website, and the payment networks are connected. And I think it's just because these scammers are just scaling these scams at such fast rates, they don't take the detail, the time to edit the language or edit the addresses. They literally just copy, paste, and relaunch and go for it. And that's what we do, and we exploit that at Chainalysis.
Yeah, fascinating. I love that. Also, it reminds me of the ICO boom where people were just plagiarizing white papers, and putting them out, calling it a different thing, but, just using the underlying white paper from some other project, and people would just pour money into it.
Yeah, this will probably lead prematurely into the wrong area, but that is bad for code quality. If there's a bug in the code that is managing this, we see this with smart contracts. A smart contract, it just cascade that code flaw, and then hackers can look for one code flaw, and then any project that forked that code that will be vulnerable to the same. They just have to rerun the same tactic, and they can get in that way.
I was also really interested. I think I'm going to try to find that address in Los Angeles and go knock on their door and see what happens.
I'll go with you.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I'll need it. Yeah, well, you'll be my wingman. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then another one that people may have heard more about, bigger, we talked about it, just touched on it, but the sanctions section of your report. So the big, so what we're talking about here is it's a department of the U.S. Treasury called the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and they basically have been sanctioning people around the world, who they think are a jeopardy to national security or, other risks. A lot of times it's individuals. It could be, leaders in Venezuela. It could be Putin and some of his folks in Russia. But in crypto, over the last couple of years, as you guys chronicle in the report, there's been a shift from naming individual, actually it was individual wallet addresses, right? A lot of times they didn't know who was behind it, but it was like this address is sanctioned, to now in the last couple of years, they're going after entities. And that's an interesting shift. I think the first one was blender.io. Mm-hmm. And then the one that caught a lot of attention just last year was Tornado Cash, because the OFAC sanctioned the use of a smart contract for, I think for the first time, right? Or I don't know if Blender qualified for that. But so basically this is code that's running on the Ethereum blockchain. And what OFAC said was, it's being used by this hacking group called Lazarus, and they are affiliated with North Koreans. There's been hundreds of millions of dollars that has gone through there that's been laundered, and they are alleging that they're using that to help fund the North Korean nuclear development program. So these aren't small things we're talking about, and it's scary stuff. But how have you seen and so now I think the sanctions part of the crime report and the whole pot has gotten a lot bigger, right? Because people, there's a lot more things that are sanctioned now. And can you just kind of speak to that and what the trend you're seeing there is?
Yeah, it's they didn't just start sanctioning mixers and services and protocols. They also were sanctioning major services like Garantex and Suex and Chadex, which are based in Russia, and we've highlighted in the past are responsible for a majority of the laundering of ransomware funds.
Yeah.
And so this did change the dynamics of our report a little bit. Whereas before this year, we would have said confidently scamming will always be the biggest type of illicit activity. Now, because they're sanctioning services, and to be consistent with our past methodology and also consistent with what we believe is the right way to approach this, now all of a sudden we have services that are moving billions of dollars that have been sanctioned. And so now we have to count those funds as illicit. We only count the funds that are flowing post designation for these services, but it still amounts to billions and billions of dollars. And it doesn't seem like this is going to be slowing. So the biggest share this year in illicit activity was sanctions associated with, for example, post-designation Garantex flows, although a big part of that was also Lazarus money, North Korean hacking organizations, which is indisputably should be included there. But it is quite a nuanced point, and as this continues, it's going to be a big part of illicit funds in our in the crypto system.
Yeah. And that's another interesting facet here is that you kind of go over three different sanctions cases. So Garantex was one. That's an exchange in Russia, but because it's in Russia, basically the sanctions weren't enforced, right? So while Garantex is on the OFAC list, and anyone, a U.S. citizen, for example, interacting with them, could be in trouble. Like the Russians are basically letting that just go and not doing anything about it. And I found it really interesting that after the sanction designation by OFAC, their volume actually went up at Garantex. Mm-hmm. They actually gained market. So, and then to just sort of close the loop here, another one was Hydra, which is a dark market, and they were basically shut down when their servers were seized in Germany in a joint U.S.-German operation. So their volume went to zero. And then you got Tornado Cash, which was sanctioned and saw a sort of mixed reaction afterward because it seemed like, as you guys said in the report, the people who were using Tornado Cash for legitimate reasons now didn't use it anymore, but criminals still continue to use it because, they're not scared of running afoul of the sanctions if they're already hacking or doing whatever they're doing to get those funds in the first place, right?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is that sanction, I think that there's always been this looming question around sanctions, which is how impactful are they? Not just in crypto, but in the world. How impactful, how do you measure the impact of a sanctioning on disrupting behaviors? And the cool thing about with cryptocurrency is we can measure that because we can look at literally how much money was received before and after a sanctioning event, and also what we call counterparties of the sanctioned party. What were they doing? How did they adapt their behavior? And what we're seeing is a differential impact based on what is sanctioned. So typically the best scenario is to pair a sanctioning event with a closure, like what we saw in Hydra. But what do you do when you sanction a service where in a jurisdiction where people don't care about sanctions? And we see that has led to continued activity. I think in that domain, we're going to be watching it long term to see if market share is gradually removed over time from services like Garantex. Maybe it's a more slow burn impact that we're monitoring. But we're starting to be able to answer these really interesting economic questions because of this data set, which is kind of another cool thing.
Yeah, and are you seeing a trend yet, or do you need more time and to sort of see how things play out?
There's still Garantex activity that's quite substantial. So we would need to, but we haven't done a full check-in yet. So it's one of those things that requires like a research hypothesis and project and in-depth dive into many of the data components. So we don't have a clear answer yet, but we will be checking in again on that.
Okay. And one thing in this area that really fascinates me is the Lazarus Group. We say that they're affiliated with North Korea, and I don't really know much about them, but I wondered if you did. And I don't think that means that they're a bunch of hackers in North Korea. Is that right? Like they're more spread out around the world, but they're just working for North Korea? Or do you know how that sort of how internally that works for them?
I don't actually know how it works internally. We don't deal with that side of the investigation. At least I don't. I think maybe some of our investigators do, but obviously a lot of the details of these investigations are tippy top secret. And so there's not like a free information flow of what is happening and where these hackers are. What we look at is what I spend my time looking at is the flow of funds, and where, if you're a hacker, how are you choosing to move your funds? Which services are you using? And one of the cool things about the Lazarus Group, or I don't know if I should phrase it like that, but one of the interesting things about the Lazarus Group is they have historically, for the past, I think at least since I started doing this in 2017, been the first to adapt their laundering strategies to incorporate new technologies into their process. So they are always using the most effective way to launder funds. A few years ago, it was non-KYC exchanges, and where they weren't really asking you for credentials, the industry tightened up. Then they went to, then they kind of started moving from mixer to mixer. Then they went to bridges. And so they're always on adapting really fast. And I think one hypothesis that I've been seeing is it's because I don't think that they care about getting caught. They only care about getting the funds to a point where they can cash it out. And a lot of these new technologies, maybe we'll figure it out in retroactively years later or months later, more about the processes they're using to launder funds. But they just want to get their funds to the off ramp, convert it to cash, and then be gone. That's their end goal.
Okay. And I think if I remember correctly, their newest one is using the Bitcoin blockchain, right? Where there's was that Lazarus doing that on the Bitcoin mixer, I believe?
We have looked at, let's see here.
I think it was they would go from ETH over to Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin was there was like a sidechain mixer or something like that was being used for the first time. But maybe I'm misremembering that from the report.
No, which mixer was it?
I don't remember the name. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's fine. One of the things that we've been pointing out has been the growth of like mom and pop mixer shops.
That's a good business to get into.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm not quite sure which ones we've named and which ones we haven't, but they're what we've seen and what is getting increasingly used are experimental new mixers that have popped up and are not really tested in the way that Tornado Cash was tested, but they are effective and they get the job done. And in a kind of a post Tornado Cash world, there has been a sprint to figure out, okay, who's next, which service is next, which mixers are next that are going to be kind of processing more and more of these funds. And there's been a little bit of a more diverse set of mixers that are processing funds. And we certainly know that North Korea doesn't just go through a mixer and then hit an off ramp. They go through a mixer, then they go through a mixer again, then they bridge, then they go through a mixer, then they use a DeFi protocol. So there's many layers to this. Okay. And then the ultimate goal is to get the funds to an exchange, though.
Okay, I just looked it up. It's called Sinbad.
Oh yeah, Sinbad.
So you say it's North Korean linked, but you don't say Lazarus, so it might not be them. But found that interesting that the Bitcoin chain is being used for that. I don't think I've heard of that before. Is that new?
No, there have been Bitcoin mixers in the past. Sinbad is definitely a newer player in the game who's been processing a lot of North Korean funds.
Okay.
And like I said, there's many stages. So the Sinbad has popped up in one of the several stages that we've seen. It's more of like there's not just one. It doesn't work like this is our strategy. It's been disrupted. Let's move our strategy. There are kind of a lot of different strategies all happening all at once, and you have to stay on top of it. And crucially to this process is it's kind of a race against the clock when you come to chasing North Korea funds because of how fast it started to move. You need to be investigating this in real time. Whenever there's a movement, you have to be the first to figure it out because the goal is to freeze funds on an exchange. And you can only do that if you alert the exchange in time. And so with what's happened with some of the big North Korean hacks is we've had a lot of success doing that. We've freezed tens of millions of dollars related to some big hacks by like live tracing these funds through the mixers, through the bridges, through everything, and then are able to get that in the hands of law enforcement.
Yeah, that's really great. And that sort of leads into the next section, ransomware. So if you're ransomware, you're taking some poor corporation or hospital, hostage, then you get crypto. You need to launder that crypto. So that's what we're just talking about with the mixers and things, right? But the big sort of note you wanted to make on ransomware was that you guys are finding that victims are becoming less willing to actually pay the ransom over the last couple of years. That's really cool. What do you think's going on there?
I think there's a few things happening. One is better data backups. We've really kind of sung from the rooftops that ransomware is a problem. And ever since Colonial, I think people have realized ransomware is a problem. So people have, there's better...
Was that the pipeline? Colonial pipeline?
Colonial pipeline, yeah. Colonial pipeline.
And how much did they get from that one? Can you just remind us?
I forget, actually. It was a big national security issue because of how the ransomware actors went after critical United States infrastructure. Yeah. And so it had that national security component to it. But so there's the fact that people have better data storage. There's also something going on with insurance companies where they're less willing to pay certain ransoms, particularly of designated ransomware entities that have been actively designated. And so the willingness to pay has gone down.
You're talking about somebody who's on the sanctions list, right?
Yeah, so exactly.
You don't want to be dealing with them even though they're extorting you, right? Because you could get in trouble for that.
Yeah. And I think that there's also just been an ethos of let's not pay these ransoms because it encourages activity. And while that puts a lot of burden on the victim, I think that it is a gradual strategy that has been adopted in conjunction with reduced insurance payout because of sanctions and also the improved data backups. But also there's been, not on the payment side, I've heard that there have potentially been disruptions in the ransomware attackers because of the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and maybe some of these bad actors have been kind of pivoting their resources to attacking to the Russian war efforts and pivoting away from attacking the United States for ransomware. Although that is more speculative, but it's just something that has been kind of going around in people's discussions of why this is happening now. Yeah,
I've got a good friend here in LA who works for a hospital chain, and they got hit a couple of years ago, and these guys are brutal. They're like taking hospitals hostage, basically, and threatening their operating systems. And then you're talking about how like on the victim side, it's getting more sophisticated, but it made me laugh in the report that it seems on the ransomware side, it's also getting a little more sophisticated, where you guys talk about this ransomware as a service kind of firm that comes up where that's, based on software as a service, where you kind of outsource when you need your software, like capabilities for your company. But now you can kind of find these ransomware folks that'll like, basically they've got the whole infrastructure set up for you. Is that right? And they'll just like, you go and do your attack and then they'll take a little cut of whatever you get.
They've got business operations, they've got customer service hotlines that you can reach out if you've been attacked and you can chat with them. We've even seen them giving surveys. How did you like our customer service experience there? I don't know if that's tongue in cheek or not, but I think that these are scaling businesses, and you can just sell a ransomware kit on the dark web and bake into the code what percentage of the proceeds goes to the developer of the ransomware. And it has allowed for now anyone can carry out a ransomware attack. And we've seen...
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's been... We see this in other domains as well. Malware as a service, phishing as a service, carrying out attacks you can purchase on the dark web.
Because, there's scammers are lazy too. They don't want to have to do all the work.
Yeah.
Let's outsource some of that. Okay. So next one is basically everything we've been talking about is leading to money laundering. Because as you mentioned, if you steal crypto in whatever capacity that we've been talking about, but you can't get it out of the system or exchange it for dollars or euros or whatever, yen, what's the point, right? You guys kind of make that point in this report. So last year there was $23.8 billion in money laundering in the crypto sphere. That's an all-time high. Mostly this happens through centralized exchanges. So can you tell us about that? Obviously, as we've mentioned, exchanges need to have know your customer rules and anti-money laundering procedures in place, and they have security teams. But how do I guess my question is, how, with that knowledge, like how does somebody use a centralized exchange to launder money these days?
There's many parts to that question. I think that the first thing to do is to say that it's really different based on different types of crime. So one thing with scamming, for example, is scams oftentimes are, no one knows that it's a scam yet, and they don't have to go through this sophisticated process of laundering money. They tend to, by and large, just plug directly into an exchange, operate as long as they can, rug money, Ponzi money, whatever they're going to do. Then they find out it's a scam, and then their funds, whatever's left, might get frozen on the centralized exchange, or they'll get off-ramped. But basically, the vast majority of scams are not creating a complex money laundering network. Rather, they're just like living on an exchange as long as they possibly can.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And then you have the sanctioned funds, where those services are getting their liquidity from centralized exchanges. And that's kind of a big theme from this report, is that centralized exchanges are providing liquidity to some of these risky services that have now been sanctioned. And so there's not complex money laundering services happening for some of these things like Garantex. Rather, they're just kind of getting their liquidity in kind of a basic way. And I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm probably not the right person to talk about that, but that's what's happening with sanctions. And then you'll go to ransomware and terrorist financing and other places where you really have to have an on-point money laundering game. And those are, occasionally we will see kind of direct connections to centralized exchanges, particularly if they're considered to be, I don't know, maybe someone has an account on them with fake credentials and it's just worked for them in the past. But also we'll see much more likely those types of activities will be using intermediaries to launder money. And then ultimately the goal is to get to a centralized exchange. It's just the steps that you take to do so are more complicated on some of these other types of crime. Yeah,
because that's how you cash out, right?
Yeah.
You got to get the crypto into dollars or whatever. It was also interesting that you noted that there is more DeFi protocols that are now involved with the money laundering kind of chain. Can you tell us why that is?
That is almost entirely driven by the fact that DeFi is the primary target for hackers. And so hackers will steal these, whatever they can get their hands on if they breach the security systems or if they take advantage of a code exploit. And then they'll be stuck with these tokens that aren't really listed on many centralized exchanges. And so they'll rely on decentralized exchanges, the liquidity pools, to swap those kind of long tail tokens. And so it's really a function of, I think it's a function of we're in DeFi land. We've got these tokens. We're limited in what we can actually do to trade these tokens. So they're forced to use some of these DeFi. I don't think there's anything inherent to DeFi. I just think that it's there. Sometimes their hands are tied. Although it does come up as well, bridging from blockchain to blockchain, I think is perceived to be a way to obfuscate detection, although it's not actually in practice. DeFi, for being the target of such a great amount of hacking, is one of the easiest things to have compliance efforts for, because you can just trace through everything. You see every buyer, you see every seller, and you can just move pretty seamlessly from contract to contract following the money. Whereas a centralized exchange tends to be a stopping point, because then it goes on to the centralized exchange and you don't really know how they handle the funds and you can't follow it to the withdrawal. So there's a lot of transparency with DeFi.
Yeah, that's a great point. On the centralized exchanges, once it's there, it's kind of a black box, right?
It's a black box. Yeah, then you'd have to rely on a law enforcement investigation or information given to you by the actual exchange itself in order to continue your investigation.
Yeah. But if like I exploit some DeFi protocol and I've got a million of these coins that don't really trade, I need to get them into Ether, for example. And that's where you go to DeFi and you use a DEX to trade those into Ether. And then I can much more easily, at least, swap that Ether for cash somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So that kind of leads into another, this was, I would say, one of the bigger DeFi exploits of the year. It was the Mango Markets exploit. And this is something you guys use the term Oracle manipulation, which I hadn't heard before, which I like. So an Oracle is it's basically a price. A good way to think about it is like, how do you know what these things are priced at any moment? And you need an Oracle to give you that pricing information. And if you can manipulate the pricing information, then you can kind of make a lot of money. And the thing that I found that you guys note was that this exploit, somebody came forward and said right away publicly that they had done it, and his name was Avram Eisenberg. And so Mango is a decentralized exchange on the Solana blockchain. And can you just kind of run us through what he did, Kim? He basically got away with, I think, about $117 million, according to my notes.
Yeah, so it wasn't a flash loan what he did, but it was a series of loans that he took out and basically used one of the low liquid tokens as leverage, and then you can really impact the price of a low liquidity token because it's low liquidity. And he was able to use a series of loans to manipulate the price of the lower liquidity assets, and then use those assets as leverage and eventually cash out and leave with $110 million by exploiting the value of these low liquidity tokens, specifically the Mango token.
Yeah, so he basically cleared out like the entire inventory, right, of that token, and it was worth that amount of money. I thought it was really clever. He had a two-sided trade, so he was on the both sides of one trade where he shorted. He took a loan for something like $400 million, shorted the Mango token, but then was on the other side of that trade where he bought all those tokens. So usually I had to think this through a little bit. If you're shorting something, it usually would push the price down. But I guess since he was there to immediately buy all of those tokens, it sent a signal to the market that there was a huge buy order. So it sent the price up. I think he was also buying some of these Mango tokens on other platforms. So then the price is suddenly way up, and he's got a ton of them. And then he can use that now, like on paper, it was $400 million or something. He can use that to as collateral to then like kind of sweep basically all the Mango tokens that they had. Is that kind of how it worked? And then that crashed, and so.
Yeah, exactly. It's taking advantage of the fact that that prices are determined by these oracles, and what even is the price of one of these tokens that no one's really buying or selling. It turns
totally
out
market
that
dependent, right?
Yeah, and it's similar to what we see in some of these liquidity pools, where there's the price is determined by the ratio of assets in the liquidity pool. And so that actually, when there's a token that is pretty low liquid, you have, it would be hard to manipulate the prices of like a Bitcoin to ETH liquidity pool, because especially if there's a lot of supply within the liquidity pool. But what we're seeing now is, and this is by far not the only Oracle attack we've seen, it was one of the few domains where there was an increase in the amount of, one thing we haven't really talked about yet is how most criminal activity is down except for a few areas, and Oracle price manipulation, a big subset of that, which is flash loans, had reached all-time highs in this past year. So this is it was marginally higher than the year before, but still it did reach that all-time high. And
can you just quickly, what's a flash loan?
A flash loan is when basically what happened with Eisenberg in the Mango attack. It's just a technical difference. It's when you just hear flash loans a lot in the industry. It's when you open and close a loan within the same transaction. And a flash loan attack would be you basically carry out the whole Oracle manipulation within one transaction. And so we had called this section flash loan, but then we realized, okay, not all of the attacks are technically flash loans. Like in the Mango attack, it's not technically a flash loan, although the concept is basically similar. And we're going to see, he's under arrest now. It's getting prosecuted, and we're going to see if this is considered to be illegal or not. And I think this is a very exciting kind of legal frontier to be in. Yeah,
I wanted to get to that, because he came out publicly and said, "Hey, I'm playing by the rules here. You know, this is how the contract is set up. This is how it works, and I followed the rules, and I was able to do this." He said it's not manipulation, but obviously the SEC, the CFTC, and I think the DOJ think otherwise, because they feel like he artificially manipulated the price, ahead of time to take his gains. So, yeah, I agree. And I remember that flash loan. There was a Bored Ape that was sold for $100 million or something that was using a flash loan, but it was all, it all got kind of canceled out. But when that craze was going on about a year ago, I recall that.
Yeah.
Well, Kim, this has been awesome. We've taken up a lot of your time. I really appreciate you going through this fascinating report with me. Can you just let folks know how they can find the report and how they can find you or Chainalysis out there in the wider world?
You can get the report on our website. You can just download it. You have to just fill out your name, and then you can download the report on chainalysis.com. And yeah, you can reach out to me if you have any research ideas, or I'm interested in all things data. If there's a new data source or anything, feel free to reach out. And it's been great to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kim, and keep up the great work.
Thanks.
Well, hey, that's it for another episode of Decent People. Thanks so much for joining us. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. Check us out on the web at decential.io. We're on Twitter at Decential Media. Our shows are produced by Matt Solon. The music is courtesy of Brian Duncan and Kareem Imes. Thanks so much. Take care.